So thank you all for being with us here tonight. Before I get started with our formal introduction, I just want to acknowledge that our president and CEO, Roy Young, is on the call with us tonight.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. Really pleased that Katie and team's hard work brings us another Montpelier expert this evening, and that's Tessa Honeycutt. She'll get a proper introduction in just a few minutes, but I just wanted to say welcome and thanks for joining us. And I'll retreat to the back of the Zoom room now, but good luck, Tessa, and enjoy. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Roy.
Thank you, Roy. Yeah, it's always good to have you on the calls. So this evening, Tessa Honeycutt is going to be talking to us about some of the projects she's been working on. But if you're unfamiliar with the Evenings with the Expert series, it's a series that explores recent research and work conducted by Montpelier staff. So these 1-hour virtual events feature preservationists, archaeologists, researchers, and other members of our team here at Montpelier. And it's basically just an opportunity for folks to learn about the things that we've got going on here on site. Things about the Madison family, the enslaved community, the US Constitution, and the site more generally. So this evening, Tessa is going to be talking with us, and she is Montpelier's architectural technician in the Architecture and Historic Preservation Department. So she sorts and organizes architectural records relating to the restoration project, which took place in the early 2000s, and we'll learn a little bit more about that later. She also aids in the management of the 3D model of the Madison House. She graduated from the University of Mary Washington in 2020 with a BA in Historic Preservation. As a historic preservationist, Tessa is passionate about the documentation of historic structures and the numerous stories they tell. And this evening, she'll be discussing a current grant project that is giving new life to many of the dusty boxes of architectural records. So over the past year or so, Tessa has been working to sort, organize, and digitize thousands of records relating to the main house restoration. And these records will soon be used to create this immersive 3D model and digital archive that, once finished, will be a valuable resource for staff, researchers, and the public. And this is a really exciting project. And I know I've been privileged enough to hear Tessa talk about this every week and just her progress on this project, and it's been really cool to hear about. So I'm very excited that she is able to join us this evening.
Well, thanks, Katie. I'm really excited to be here.
And I want to provide folks, I'm sure you all are Montpelier experts, but I just like to provide a little bit of context about the site and its history, particularly since the house, the mansion itself, the Madison House, and the different phases of kind of Madison occupation is really important to what we're talking about this evening. So our story begins with Francis and Ambrose Madison, who are the president's grandparents. And they basically acquired this property in 1723. And it's not until the 1760s when their son, James Madison Sr., has his enslaved workers build this large brick mansion on the site that we associate with the Madison House today. Now, it doesn't look like it does today because his son, James Madison Jr., who will become the 4th president of the United States, is actually going to make big changes to that structure over 2 periods of time. And so that's something Tessa will talk a little bit about tonight. And then after the Madisons sell the property, so Dolly sells the property in 1844, there's obviously a series of changes to the house itself and the property. And there's a series of different owners, but the most, I would say, impactful is probably the DuPont period. And the DuPont family bought the property in 1901 and lived here until 1983. And that's when they donated it to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And so they added about, correct me if I'm wrong, Tessa, it went from 22 rooms as a Madison house into 55 rooms as a DuPont house.
Yes.
And that's so huge changes, a lot of expansion. And when the trust basically acquired this property, there was a lot of questions about, can this place be restored? What does that look like? And it was a pretty contested decision in the historic preservation field at the time. And in 2000, a feasibility study was conducted indicating that much of the actual Madison part of the house was original. So the decision was made to restore the house to what it looked like during James Madison Jr., the president's retirement years, 1817 to 1836. So the actual restoration of this building took place from 2003 to 2008 and was one of the largest historic building restorations of its kind. So it's really a unique kind of preservation project. So tonight, Tess is going to talk about the restoration process itself, but also her work in digitizing all of these records from that project from 2003 to 2008. So I will hand it over to Tessa. Can you just kind of get us started before you go into specifics of the digitization process? Tell us about the restoration project and why it was so significant.
Yeah, so I will actually share screens for a moment because I do have some images that I think would be good to see. Can you see this, Katie? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So this pink house over here is what the house was when the DuPonts owned it. So this was from about 1901 to the 1980. Well, actually, up until 2003 when the restoration started. And this over here is the house as we see it today. And this is what it would have looked like during Madison's retirement period. So as you can see, huge additions happened during this DuPont occupation. Wings were added onto the back. The wings on the side of the house were raised to 2 stories. The roof was totally changed. The portico changed and they dropped it down all the way to the ground, regraded in front of the house. And a lot inside the house also changed. Walls were removed, doors removed, rooms were created out of other rooms, hallways. So all this happened in really a short period of time. And we were very lucky that the DuPonts were very frugal in how they changed and expanded their house. They reused a lot of material. They didn't really throw a lot out. They really kept it and just moved it other places on the property or used it in other buildings. For example, the rafters from these wings over here, they have very special rafters in them because they have flat roofs. Those rafters were actually found in the bowling alley that the DuPonts constructed. So they reused that material. And so when it came to the talk of restoration, when Marion DuPont Scott left the DuPont house to the National Trust, she specified in her will that her wish was for it to be returned to the Madison period. And thankfully, she left some money. She left the wish for it to be restored. And that really got people thinking, well, maybe we should restore. But then that really did bring up this whole conversation. Well, how do you find the Madison house? Is it even still there? Like, it's changed so much. How are we going to do this? Is it even possible? And there was also a lot of controversy over the DuPont house was, in preservation theory, would have been significant in its own right, because it was more than 50 years old, which is what the building has to be historically significant in the preservation world. And also the DuPonts were they did a lot in the community of Orange, the horse races, all these other things, like they were kind of significant locally. Marion DuPont Scott did a lot for women in the equine industry. So it was like, how do you tear away history? How are we going to do that? And eventually what they decided on was to do this 2-year investigation period, which to see how much of the house was there, was it possible, how much is this going to cost? And when they got into the house, they really did almost archaeology inside the house. It was really cool the way they did it. They would cut these square units into the wall and they would take steamers and they would slowly like peel each layer back, each layer of paint, each layer of wallpaper until they hit brick or lath. And then they would look at that and be like, is this Madison era? Is this DuPont era? What is this? Because building technologies change so much that you can date, it's easily to date things. So they could tell very easily what was Madison and what wasn't. And after 2 years of investigations of paint and lath and floors and everything, they cut units all over the house. They found that almost 80% of the house was still there. And the DuPonts really just encapsulated it within their own house and just kind of built around it. And after that was found out and they brought that back to the restoration board, they got the green light for it. They were like, okay, the house is there, we can do this. And luckily there was a grant from the Mellon Fund that gave us the $24 million needed to restore the house. So that's really how the restoration came about. And it took about 6 years. It was a pretty fast restoration for all the work that needed to be done. But I think at the end of it, this is as close to the Madison house as we could have gotten to. There was a lot of really great archaeology and investigations that were done to get us to what we have today.
I appreciate your point about this period of significance where the DuPont structure itself, because it was 50 years and older, would have been considered significant enough to preserve in and of itself without tearing it away and actually restoring the Madison era house. So yeah, that's a very interesting point. And obviously this was a huge undertaking, massive project. And those involved did a very thorough job of documenting this process, especially since there was a lot of questions about whether or not it should even be done. So can you talk about the volume of material and data collected as part of that project and how you make sense of it all coming in today?
Yeah, so the restoration, there came so much data out of the restoration, so many records. They did an excellent job of documenting everything they did, documenting the DuPont house, documenting every single day, every little thing that happened was very well documented. There was staff who their day-to-day job was to take pictures of what was going on. We have over 100,000 images from these 6 years of the restoration. And that is a huge amount of images. And I'm going through them one by one to figure out where they are, what's happening, and I tag it with all this relevant information that will make it easier to put it into the model later. And then we also have videotapes. I love the videotapes. They're one of my favorite things from the restoration. We have, I think, almost 200 hours worth of video footage from the restoration. And that one of the hardest things for me coming into this project was I knew very little about the restoration. And they kind of just threw me in there, like, in the deep end right off the bat. They were like, here you go, here's 70 boxes of restoration material. And all I knew was there was a restoration that happened. I did not really understand the extent of it or how it was done. And I spent my first 3 months looking through boxes and boxes of records. And that was what taught me about the restoration. And really the videotapes was what really helped me understand what was going on. They did really great interviews with a lot of the tradesmen and the people who worked on the restoration, and listening to their interviews and listening to them talk about what their day-to-day life was like, or what their favorite part of the restoration was. That was so cool. I've recently started rewatching them again just to refresh in my mind and to use some of that for other things that I'm creating. So the videotapes are awesome to see the tradesmen work and mill out the lumber or to do the things that needed to be done day to day. We also have about 900 architectural drawings that are made on CAD. They would have been what the tradesmen would have been using to make what they make the materials needed for the house or to construct the things. And then we have about 7 boxes, big archival boxes of field notes that we're taking day to day. That's where the people working on the restoration would have been taking notes in the field. They would have been drawing sketches of things and taking measurements, and then those would have been given to somebody and they would have made actual drawings from them or used them for other things. So that's also really interesting to look at, because sometimes it's kind of hard to tell what they are, but it's interesting to kind of look at them and figure out, where is this? What are they trying to do here in this drawing? What does this drawing mean? But really looking through all that has helped me understand what the DuPont house looked like, what the Madison house looked like, and just what the day-to-day life was for the people who were working on this project.
And it sounds like there's different types of documentation, which is interesting. So the videos, but also photos, but then you've got the architectural drawings, the field notes. So it's interesting that you've got so many different pieces that you can kind of put together to help kind of paint this broader picture, which I'm sure is probably a pretty unique perspective, because tradesmen are coming in and kind of doing their, what they're specified to do, but you're kind of taking this broader overarching look, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And can you talk about how all of that documentation and that process, how it plays into the project you're working on now?
Yeah, so our goal with this project is really to create an archive that's accessed through a 3D model that allows the public and just anybody to access all these records very easily. As we kind of talked about earlier, this restoration was almost revolutionary. It changed the way we thought about the house. It changed the way restoration was really like looked at historic houses, and this idea that you can tear some history off to other things. So it's very, I think this research is so important that not only our staff can get to it, but the public can have access to it too. Because up until a year ago, all this stuff was sitting in boxes in our storage building and nobody knew what was there. Nobody knew the extent of it, what it had to say. And there were great finds found during the restoration, and they were just sitting in a box collecting dust and nobody had any access to them. So with this project, finding a way to make these records accessible in a way that's easily searchable too is one of the main goals. And the way we're kind of doing this is by going through each single record individually, figuring out what it is, where it's from, which phase of the restoration, whether it was like investigation or deconstruction or removal or fabrication, all that stuff. And we're tagging it with these keywords. So you can like tag an image with these words, and then they're going to be linked to the model. So everything in the model is selectable. Actually, let me share screens for a minute again. I'll come down here to the model. Let it generate for a minute. So this is our model, our 3D model of the house. This is already publicly accessible. This is a part of a blog post that I wrote about the restoration in my project a couple months ago, but you can go ahead and anybody can access this right now. But the cool thing about this model is everything is selectable. So I can select this column and it brings up this table here. And this table is where all our records are going to be tagged. So every element on this house has a specific ID that goes with it. So this window is ID number W105-1. That means W stands for window. 105 is the room number. So it's the 5th room on the 1st floor. And then the -1 means that it's the first window in that room. So everything has these unique identifiers, and we use that to tag these records with. So then those records can be tied back to it. So then eventually, this is kind of bare bones right now. We haven't gotten all the records tagged yet, but eventually the records will be able to be linked into this table through that ID number. So if you needed to if you wanted to see a picture of this window from its fabrication period, you can come here and see fabrication image, and it'll be linked right here, which is super cool. And all the drawings will be here. All the video about this window will be here, and that will go for every element of this house. So like this will have its own things. Each of these chimney stacks will have their own table, and everything linked to it will be there. And that's kind of how we're going to use this as a way to immerse yourself and search an archive in a different way. Archives, a lot of times, I'm sure, Katie, you've experienced this, where you're doing research and you go to an archival site and there's a Google, like almost like a Google search bar, and you key in what you're looking for and one thing pops up. And then you like, oh, I'll use a broader term, and then a million things pop up. And then it's not digitized. So you have to contact somebody, and then they have to, and it's just such a hassle. We're here, you can come to the model and be like, I need to know every record about this door right here. And you can just click on it and it'll all be there easily for you. Also, another thing is sometimes different terminology can trip people up in search engines. So for instance, during the restoration, we didn't call the chair rails, we called them surbases, which is like a historical architectural term for them. But if you don't know that, and if we just had a regular archive and you went and searched chair rail, nothing would come up. Not because Montpelier doesn't have chair rails, but because we just call it something different. And maybe not everybody will know that. So this is, I think, a really great way to make our archives searchable and easily searchable for the public who might not always know all these architecture terms, or even for other staff who don't know the architectural terms, like I do, since that's what I study.
Every future Madison researcher is going to want to give you a hug after that, Tessa, because it's very true. When you're trying to find the information you need, oftentimes you have to know specific keywords in order to find what you need. And it can be a very exhausting process. And so the fact that this is going to make it so accessible, not just for scholars, but also for regular folks who want to better understand this place. And I think, the way that the landscape in the house looks now, it looks like it did during Madison's retirement years. But sometimes we have a hard time picturing what it looked like, maybe, when James Madison Sr. lived there and the house wasn't quite as extensive. So it sounds like this project is really going to allow you to better visualize how this structure and the landscape changed over time.
Yes.
And I know we've been talking a lot about the restoration of the house itself, but this project encompasses more than that. So it's also an extension of the grounds as well. And it's really important, at any of these presidential sites to understand the entirety of the grounds, this whole space, and what's happening in the Madison House and how it's facilitating kind of these other spaces and the meaning associated with them. So for example, food being served, at the Madison family table is being cooked in the kitchens in the south yard, which is the kind of smaller white structures outside in the south of the house. And, there's a whole, if you've been to Montpelier and you go out the back, there's a flat kind of back space outside of the mansion, which served as kind of their backyard or a barbecue space. So, how we frame the house really influences how we understand the landscape. And I'm just curious how this project and working on it and like having this knowledge of the house and the restoration, how it's kind of shaped your perceptions of the other spaces at Montpelier.
Yeah, so the original scope of this project was mainly focused on the main house, but I think kind of really getting into this project, we realized how important it is to have these other structures on the landscape. Just to tell the full complete story of Montpelier, you can't just have the house without these other spaces. Kind of like what we were talking about last week with the planner's cottage. The main house couldn't have been built without the planner's cottage because they had to have somewhere to live while it was being built, and how these buildings really interacted. So a lot of what I've been really thinking about is how can we model other buildings on the property to show their interaction with the main house. So I have been working on some little rudimentary models of the South Yard buildings to kind of get them in the model. Right now we have just kind of like placeholders in the model for all the other buildings, but I do think it is very important to kind of link those in. Also, we have a lot of, just for the South Yard, for example, we have a lot of information for them that could also need to be tied in because they're also just kind of sitting in boxes waiting for their time to shine. There was the whole reconstruction period of those buildings. So there's drawings and field notes and research for that. Also, the archaeology done in that area is also super important and has given us so much information about the property and changed the way we kind of think about the South Yard and how the people there lived and interacted. And I think it'd be really great to see that information put in there as well, just to kind of tell this fuller story, because it's not, the main house isn't in isolation. It was built with all these other buildings, and it's not just up here on its little hill all by itself. It's all dependent on everything, even the forest behind it, like thinking about where some of this wood for the house would have been forested. Could it have been forested on property? Or where we know the clay for the bricks came was from the property somewhere. So thinking about those things, we can't have the house without the rest of the property. So I really think it is important to model those other things and to really bring those into the discussion when we're creating stories or interpretive things to go along with the model.
And this is kind of implied in the last question, but to more directly address it, how does this project kind of shed light on the lives of the enslaved people in these spaces?
Yeah, so I definitely, a lot of times I think there's the people don't realize who actually built Montpelier. James Madison did not build Montpelier, he commissioned Montpelier. His enslaved community built Montpelier, and so did the communities of the main builders that he hired for this job, probably Dinsmore, Chisholm. They would have probably have brought along their own enslaved workers. They probably would have been more like overseers, planning the work, maybe doing some of it, but the day-to-day labor was done by the enslaved workers. And I think really getting into the materiality of the house is where you're going to see that. So kind of looking at these records and really looking at the photography and seeing how the house was built. That was all the direct result of the enslaved community here at Montpelier. And I think it also brings up a lot of other questions. Like, did they have any say in the design? Did they go to Dinsmore and say, hey, you know, your design is good, but this might work better with these bricks because I know how the clay is here and I know how the clay is going to burn. Were they doing things like that? Like how much say did they have in things? And I think those are really interesting questions to think about. And I think it just, when you start to think about the human interaction with this building and how James Madison would have been living in the planter's cottage was a child and looked out the window and seen the enslaved community out there every day building this humongous house for him. Like, how would that have affected him? And how can we see the enslaved community in the house? And one way is fingerprints and bricks, which is so interesting to see. And it really brings that humanity to a house, to know that here at Montpelier and in most historic buildings, brickmaking was left to enslaved women and children. So to think that a child helped build Montpelier is insane to think about. And I think really diving into that and thinking not so much of Montpelier as just this house, but as this thing that all these different people laid their hands on. So many people worked on this house. And I think one thing I've been thinking about is, how do you see women in architecture? What type of impact did women have on this house? And think about the women who worked on the restoration and the impact that they made on the house, and thinking about originally when the house was built, how did women impact? How did Dolly Madison impact the design of the house? So thinking about all those things, a lot of these things I don't have answers to right now, but thinking about them has made me think of the house in a much different way, and it makes me see the house in a different way.
That's interesting to think about. I have never really thought or consciously at least thought about how we do describe the Madison House in a very gendered way. Like, it's obviously associated with the fourth president, but you know, obviously women in the enslaved community were probably involved in the construction of it. Dolly Madison was probably involved in it, you know, in terms of decoration and how she wanted people to move through that space, because she was very intentional with her politics and probably how she, you know, wanted things to be, how the layout was. So yeah, I think that's a really exciting way of thinking about it, and also a potential project for the future.
Yes.
And I'm curious to hear more about kind of what, because obviously this is a very valuable project. So what was kind of the impetus, and what do you hope to accomplish by creating this digital 3D model?
I really hope that that this model will be used for public engagement, and I hope the public interact with it. I also hope that it will be used here by staff, and even for interpretation means, I think just being in the pandemic, access has really been brought to my mind, and realizing how during quarantine you couldn't access things. So how do you make things accessible to people? And then I was thinking, there are plenty of people, plenty of potential Montpelier visitors that will never be able to come to site. Most people cannot actually physically ever come here. So having this model, I think, gives people who can't physically come here a way to experience the house without being at the property. And it's a way of experiencing the house that's much different than just looking at pictures or watching a video or reading a book about it. It's a little more immersive, I think. You can get a feel for the house and the landscape and how things are laid out in a much different way. I also hope that this model can be used for people who can't access the second floor of the house. Our second floor is not accessible, but only through stairs. So if you can't make it to the second floor of the house, you're missing out on this whole level of the house. That's where the Constitution was wrote. It's where all these other things happen. It's half the house, and you got to just miss out on it, which is really unfortunate. And I hadn't realized how many people can't make it to the second floor until I worked front lines here and working front lines, and how many people be like, oh, I can't make it upstairs. Like, is it wheelchair ramp accessible? Be like, well, the first floor is, but the second floor is not. And I know they have other interpretive material for people who can't make it on the second floor, but I think if the model could be used for them to experience the second floor, it's a much different experience. I'm also hoping that maybe in the future, I know this isn't possible right now, but maybe in the future, virtual reality could be used to experience the model, which I think would be super interesting and cool. It's something I have looked into, but it's right now, I don't think GIS, which is the program we work on the model with, is compatible with that. But I really hope that people will use it. My fear is that I will do all this work and then nobody will use it, which I don't think is the case. I really hope people will use it. So I think that's my big goal, is to have information available to the general public and to other scholars. I remember being in college and trying to get information, and sometimes it was so difficult. And I think and for staff, like, I think just having, not gatekeeping your knowledge and allowing it to be accessible to other people is very, very important. And I know Montpelier is doing a really good job of digitizing a lot of their stuff. I know curation upstairs is working on some digitization. I think research is, so I think that's very, very important. And we should be able to share all our knowledge with everybody, because it's the public's right to be able to access this stuff.
And that's not necessarily something that's very widespread across kind of the board, unfortunately. In terms of kind of the academic side of things, it's not really, our archives are often, as you kind of mentioned, this almost like a gate. You can't cross it unless you are a researcher. So a lot of times archives will not give you access to records that should be publicly accessible, because you are not somebody who's there intending to publish something through the research. So I think you make a very good point about making this information accessible to people virtually too, in terms of making sure everybody who visits Montpelier feels welcome and feels like they can have that full experience, even if they're not physically able to kind of make it up to the second story. And that's a really, I would say, relevant topic in historic preservation, at least in terms of kind of my experience in the field. That is coming up a lot, not just in terms of interpreting stories of disabled people in the historical record, but also talking about how we make these landscapes and historic houses accessible to people, because most of the time, obviously, structures have to be up to code. But if it's a historic site, obviously you don't want to ruin the integrity of Montpelier, the Madison house. But what does that mean for people who are unable to kind of participate in that experience?
And that's such a tricky topic, because again, like, you don't want to ruin the historic integrity of a house, but then again, it's just not fair to people who have disabilities and can't physically make it. And it's such a tricky topic. And that's where I really think digital technologies can really come to the forefront and come to help solve some of these inequality issues. And things like VR, I've seen VR be used in really, really great ways. Virtual reality is getting so real nowadays that it's really impressive. And I think being at the forefront of kind of this digital wave that's coming through, I think is setting us up in a great position to be a leader in this type of technology, and especially if we keep working towards it. And I really hope that once this project is done, that it's not something that we leave behind. I hope that Montpelier will continue to work towards digital applications for their research in the house and how they're interpreting and allowing accessibility.
And I think that's one of the exciting things about this project. As you mentioned, it kind of positions Montpelier in a place to be a leader in terms of providing this immersive experience and providing this data. And I'm just curious if you know of any other projects similar to this one, maybe at other sites, or in your experience, if you've encountered anything similar.
No. I have not experienced anything similar with any of the work that I've done. And I've also have not heard of any other institutions doing any work like this currently. So it is super exciting to say that I am working on this project that's hopefully going to be revolutionary in our field and change the way people think about archives and digital media. So it's really exciting, and it's really rewarding work, I think, for me.
And thinking more broadly, not just about this project, but preservation in general, how do you get people excited about old buildings? Obviously, we think it's very important, or else we would not be on the call today. But how do you make people understand the value and significance of a project like the restoration of the Madison House and landscape?
Yeah, so this is something that I have thought a lot about because along with working on the model, I create blogs essentially to talk about specific aspects of the restoration. And it's tricky because I think, well, I usually think when I'm thinking of blog topics, what would I read? What would I sit and take 15 minutes to read? And I think if this was a chemistry blog, what would make me read it? And I think that it has to be fun and it has to be engaging. And I think one of the things that I've really looked for is to look for those oddities or those hooks that will get people's attention. Titles are everything. So trying to, and that's like one of my least favorite things to do is come up with a title because sometimes I'm just not creative with puns or things like that. So sometimes that's really hard. I actually get a lot of inspiration from the Lives and Legacy blog that the George Washington Foundation puts out. That's Historic Kenmore and Fairy Farm. They have an awesome blog. If any of y'all have not seen it, go read it. They write about the most weird little niche things that they come across, whether it's grossology or porta potties in the 17th century or like spy rings, and they find these really cool, unique things. So I draw a lot of inspiration from them. And for example, I wrote a blog called Finding Ghosts in Montpelier, which was ghost is an architectural term used for when it's an outline left behind by a material that's been removed. So I kind of had that hook on there, and I think that blog actually did pretty well, which was really exciting. It was a fun blog to write. I released it on Halloween. It was a fun little thing to do. But I think finding things like that makes architecture fun and not just so technical. I think architecture is seen as a very technical thing, and it is in some ways, but it's also a lot of fun to dig into how a building is built, because we all use buildings. Like, we all engage with architecture every single day. So I think it's very important to get the public hooked on architecture. And I hope that everybody becomes as excited about architecture as I am. But trying to get there is sometimes even difficult for me. So I'm like, what makes this interesting to me? Like, how can I make a random college student sit down for 30 minutes and read my blog? And I use a lot of multimedia in my blogs, which I think is something else that's very helpful. I try to mix in photos with video, with the model, so it's kind of engaging and interactive. I think I use a program called ArcGIS Story Maps, which is really, it does great stuff with time sliders and like slideshows. It can do some really cool stuff. So I think making your material fun and interactive is like the best way to draw people's attention. But it's something that's constantly changing. I keep thinking about it with, the pandemic and people's attention spans getting shorter because we're on the screen all the time. It's like, how can I get people the most information in the shortest amount of time in the funnest way possible? So that's really my goal sometimes.
I think trying to kind of reach that college age demographic is one of the most challenging things. And as you said, I think a lot of visuals and different ways to engage, like story maps, is a really fun and exciting way. And I have to say, I didn't know you were releasing that blog post about the ghosts and that title totally hooked me. And so you reached your demographic in that regard, because I was, yep. And I'm just curious, kind of in wrapping up at least kind of our discussion part of this conversation, what are the next steps for this project? Like, when do you see it culminating? When should people look for this resource on the website, or how will it be released, basically?
So the model is going to be released through the online platform of ArcGIS. We'll probably integrate it into the website somehow. We're still kind of trying to figure all those logistics out, especially with our website's doing some changing right now. So kind of getting those kinks kind of thought about, but hopefully towards the end of this year. Right now, I'm almost through the 100,000 photos. I got, I think, 4,000 left. I've been working on that for probably the past year. every single day, 500 photos a day, slowly inching through them. So once that is pretty much done, it's going to be a matter of getting everything linked into the model. And hopefully, I don't know how long that's going to take. I'm hoping that's, as long as we don't hit any road bumps, any serious road bumps, hopefully by the end of the year, we can have this model kind of up and running. And we're also, I've been working on making some other layers for the model to show some things like, I will show real quick, masonry repair, and using the CAD drawings to kind of show other things. So let me share screens for a minute. But so this is the model that I work on. This is one that's not publicly accessible right now. This is my model.
I think we're
But
looking at, I think we're looking at the publicly accessible one.
okay, hold on, let me stop for a second.
Sure.
And let me reshare. Let me pull this on over. Screen share. Share. Okay. Does this look like GIF?
Yes. Yep, that's
Okay.
the one.
Okay, yeah. So this is the model that I work on a day-to-day basis, and from here it gets uploaded into the online to the publicly accessible format. But so here I've taken from CAD drawings, and I have cut them out and made these little layers that show where masonry was repaired on the house. So all these little, all these little white areas are where during the restoration, masonry had to be removed and repaired. The masonry here was too deteriorated or it was gone. So there's other things like this that we're hoping to make that really show records in a different way, because currently this is just a CAD drawing. It's a architectural drawing that's 2D. So kind of taking it and showing it on this 3D model of where, like for instance, right here is where a gutter was, and the gutter was carved into the brick. So they had to repair that brick, and where windows were taking out and things were changed. So I think that's really cool to see records in a different way. And I'm hoping to make more stuff like this and more story maps, more blogs, hopefully in the future.
Wow, that's really cool. Thank you for showing just like a little taste of what, you work on every day. That's really cool. And as you said, it's different from like seeing a file that has notes on it or like a photo of it. You're actually getting this more immersive way of understanding the data. It's a totally different way that, it hasn't been looked at in this way before, which is incredibly exciting. And I could probably ask you questions all night, but I want to respect our audience's time. So I want to open it up for questions from the audience. And if you do have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. And we do have a couple of questions. So let's see. One, Jay Isaac asks, as the architectural expert on site, I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the restoration of the house and what kinds of steps were taken to ensure that the materials were used as close to the original material as possible. So glass, nails, bricks, for example.
Yeah. So during the restoration, a lot of samples were taken to kind of identify exactly what they were using, what types of wood they were using. And I know especially for like the floors that had to be replaced, they salvaged wood or lumber from an old mill, I think in South Carolina, to have wood that would have been felled at pretty much the same time, the same type of wood. So it'd have almost that same type of texture and feel and work that would make the floors as accurate as possible. Other thing, a lot of the material was saved. The DuPont saved a lot of the material. So it was found and like removed. So when the doors had been moved to other additions, they would find those doors, take them out, do some repairs to them, and then put them back where they were. The restoration was not completely, they used some modern materials when they needed to. So it wasn't all the time historic materials, historic trades. There were times when, for example, with the stairs, to support the stairs and to support having 12 visitors walk up the stairs at once, they had to be reinforced with things like steel or modern screws. But otherwise, a lot of our nails were handmade. Our shingles were handmade. Well, they weren't exactly handmade, but there was some work on them. So what could be replaced with original material with original techniques was done. Our tradesmen were fantastic. They were amazing. They could do modern stuff. They could do historic trades. All our plaster in the house was made with traditional lime horsehair plaster. Our paint, some of our paints are traditional distempered made paint using traditional methods. But then on some walls that get a lot of visitor engagement, we use modern latex paint that won't wear as quickly. So it really was that push and pull on where to use historic stuff, where to use modern stuff, and what was best for the house and for its use to be a historic house museum. But that was a great question.
We have another question from Jennifer Powers. Do you think digital models and virtual reality, et cetera, can help with the cost prohibition that can also prevent people from visiting historic sites just as much as physical accessibility?
I hope so, because again, yeah, that is true. It is also not exactly, we're not free. You cannot come to the house for free. So I would hope that, especially if you have a large group or if you have like a lot of kids or like, you know, sometimes it is expensive to come, that usually this model will help kind of cut that down and how give people options on what they can do. Are people who come and want to walk the grounds, but you know, maybe don't want to tour the house because it's $35, they can be like, oh, well, I can explore the digital model for free. So I really hope that it will give people options of what they can do here.
Yeah, I think, isn't that always the struggle too? It's like, you know, if a family in California has a real interest in James Madison, but they can't afford a plane ticket to travel out to Virginia or whatnot, people shouldn't be, you know, denied the knowledge or the experience of Montpelier just because they can't afford to come here. So it's kind of exciting to think about how that could open up a whole new visitor base for us, you know, and that's again one of the exciting kind of cutting new things in museums, preservation, interpretation. It's like, how do we define visitation to a site? And obviously the virtual world, you know, as you mentioned, Tessa, because of the pandemic, is becoming even more essential. So yeah, that's a great question and an exciting thing to think about. We also have a question from Kat. Will the videos also be accessible to the public? And if so, will they be searchable by certain topics?
Yes. So the way the videos will also work is they're also going to be included in that little box that pops up. So I have gone through and watched all the videos and I'm tagging them with what's being done, what rooms they're being included, all these different tags so that they will also be able to be found in those little text boxes that pop up. I also use videos in any story maps that I make. So I made a map about faux graining that was done in the house. And I have video of during the restoration, an artist from Orange redoing the faux graining on the stair newel. So that is linked in there. So anytime that I make a story map and I know that I have video footage for what I'm talking about, I include that in. But yes, all the video will be publicly accessible.
We also have a question about what is the most interesting thing about this project that you've learned so far?
I think the most interesting thing for me is when I come across records and it's records of the craftsmen just being silly or having fun or just, you know, I find videos of them just goofing off, you know. Sometimes I think about the people who worked on the restoration being so serious, you know, they're, you know, chiseling wood all day, you know, or like painting and just doing that. But, you know, like they had fun on the restoration. Like there's videos of them decorating the porta-johns for Christmas with Christmas lights, or like when I come across a field note and there's a funny little doodle in the corner, or meeting minutes and there's doodles all over it because they were bored during a meeting, you know, like that I think is so fun because it makes them feel so much more personable to me. I was like 5 years old when the restoration happened. I didn't grow up near here. I knew nothing about it, but coming here and watching videos and like seeing what the tradesmen and what the people who worked on the restoration kind of created, I almost feel like I know them, even though I've never met them. They have no idea who I am, but like I feel like I know them so well. I can ID them in pictures by name, and I'm like, oh, like this tradesman probably did this work. And it's just, I think that's one of the funnest things for me. And those are the kinds of moments that I like find myself like, it's just so fun. It puts a little bit of excitement in sometimes in my days where sometimes I'm just going through pictures one by one and it's kind of boring to like come across a funny picture of like the tradesman like goofing off. I think that's a lot of fun. So
It's almost like a window into like the field of preservation and how it's also a very human process. And
mhm.
it's funny that you're studying this period in the early 2000s, but it's like a period in history that you're studying in addition to, the Madison era, which is actually really cool
Yeah.
to think about.
Like you think about things you study as being so long ago. I studied something that happened 20 years ago in depthly. I've been studying it for a year and it's so crazy because when I was in college, I studied 18th century buildings and 18th century trades. And now here I am studying things that happened 20 years ago. How were they doing? How were the trades different? How was the materials? So it is really interesting to have kind of like that switch. I'm still studying an 18th century building, but it's so different. I'm studying a 21st century version of an 18th century building, it's interesting.
It's like the layers of history that are at Montpelier. There's so many different layers, and the restoration, even though it's recent, is still a part of, it's one layer of history at this
Mhm.
place, which is really, really cool. We have a question. Is this part of the project to tie documentary evidence to the parts of the house? For example, records on when and from where items were purchased, such as wallpaper, materials for curtains, etc. Or if there may be diary or letter entries that would give more information on Dolly or other people's influence on the building of the house.
So currently that is not part of the scope of work for this project. That is, all that material is under the care of our head researcher. I do not have access to a lot of that material, but I would hope that maybe one day that could also be included into the house because I think that is very important. And a lot of that material was used to make decisions on how the house was going to be restored. I know when it comes to the wallpaper, they were looking at what Dolly was buying for a house that she was wallpapering in DC. So things like that I think could be very important, and it all links back together. The restoration was one of those times where it wouldn't have happened if we didn't all work together. So that was preservation, working with archaeology, working with research, working with curatorial, and it all kind of interlapped together. So I would love, that is a really good point that I hadn't really thought about. I would love to see all this information come together in this model. And I think it would be a really, really interesting way to look at it, to not only see the restoration material or the archaeology material, to see the research material or primary documents. I think that would be a really cool idea. So hopefully in the future, maybe we can tie that in.
I think that question also speaks to what you've been saying, Tessa, is that it really is a project, not just the restoration, but kind of your project as well. And everything we do here at Montpelier is very interdisciplinary. So it includes the preservation of the house, but it also includes the archaeology of the house. It includes, the historic records. It includes the curation of the objects. And so without all of those pieces, you're only getting part of the story. And so it's exciting to think about. It's kind of like our panel last week where we discussed the planter's cottage, which was, where Madison grew up as a child, but it also became a kitchen for enslaved people. And we found that story through all of these different disciplines speaking together, which is really cool. There's also a question about what is the one thing you would like people to take away from this about historic preservation?
Oh, if there's one thing I would like everybody to know about preservation, is that anybody and everybody can do preservation. It's one of those things that you don't have to have a degree to do preservation. It's as simple as, if you have an older house, making decisions that retain that historic integrity, or thinking about how it was built or how it was made. Or if you don't have a historic house, if you live near a historic downtown, instead of going to Starbucks to get coffee, go to the coffee shop in a historic building downtown, because investing in those businesses invest in the building, which retains the historic character. So you don't have to be you don't have to be like me and work at Montpelier and work on a 3D modeling project to be a preservationist. You can take small steps to be preservationists in your own communities. And a lot of the best preservation movements are grassroots preservation movements that start with community members. So if to think about it, Marion DuPont Scott was a great preservationist because she left us the Montpelier house and left us the money and the what we needed to preserve the Montpelier house or to restore it. So that is the one thing I think I would like everybody to know about preservationists is that everybody can do it. So appreciate your historic buildings.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point. It's something we can all participate in. Well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time because we're coming up on the hour. But thank you all for joining us this evening. And we do have another event coming up virtually next week. If you're interested in joining us, we have an installment in our Legacies of the Constitution series, which is new. It's a new series that examines the U.S. Constitution and its impact on all those living in the United States, past, present, and future. So next week, we're going to have Ella Wagner, who's a PhD candidate at Loyola College in Chicago, talking with us about women's temperance and suffrage. And she'll be looking at how the women's temperance movement defined the legal landscape and how this kind of debate, not just in the passage of the 18th Amendment, which outlawed the sale of alcohol, but what the repeal of the 18th Amendment meant for people. That was a big deal to repeal a constitutional amendment. So it's going to be a really interesting kind of dive into what that meant for different social groups. That's going to take place next Wednesday, March 30th at 7 o'clock. So if you're interested, please visit our website at montpelier.org. And of course, please visit us in person, at least until Tessa has finished the 3D model where you can check it out online. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time this evening, and I hope you have a good one.